Good day. Yesterday was another grim day for Ukraine, for the Ukrainian people, and to some extent for Ukraine's Western sponsors, or perhaps I should more accurately say for the Western sponsors of the current government in Kiev. The big news, the one that's attracted the most attention, is the fact that at least two, possibly three Patriot missile launchers and the attendant systems and radar vehicles and all of the rest were destroyed by the Russians near the Ukrainian town of Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk, by the way, the Russians refer to as Krasnoarmeysk, which is, of course, its former Soviet name. The Russians continue to use former Soviet names for Ukrainian towns and cities because they do not recognize the legitimacy of the laws which Ukraine has passed purporting to change the names of these towns and cities, thus the confusion. But anyway, going back to the topic of the Patriots, there is no doubt that this has happened. There's extensive drone footage of it. Western journalists have been writing about this. Julian Röpke, the correspondent of Germany's BITCHUTE newspaper, has published an extremely bitter statement about it on Twitter X. And, there is no doubt that these two, or perhaps three, Patriot batteries, and as I said, and all the attendant systems were destroyed. Apparently, those who are able to distinguish between Patriot systems, something which, of course, I can't remotely do, say that this is one of the systems that was donated by Germany, as can be confirmed by identification of the vehicles. In other words, it's not the American system. My understanding is that the American Patriots are all based around Kiev and remain there. The systems that Ukraine has been deploying on the battlefields are those which have been donated by Germany and the Netherlands. Anyway, putting all that aside, this is the latest in a catastrophic sequence of destructions of key Ukrainian air defense assets. Before I continue on that topic, I should say that there is one enigma about this particular strike on this Patriot missile complex. There is no doubt whatsoever that the missiles that were destroyed, the air defense system that was destroyed, was a Patriot system, but for some unknown reason, the Russian Defense Ministry, in its Defense Ministry update, referred to it as an S-300 system close to Pokrovsk. Who knows why? Possibly they've got themselves confused and muddled up there. The other odd thing is that this particular update refers to the town as Pokrovsk rather than Krasnoarmeysk, whereas I remember other Defense Ministry updates referring to it as Krasnoarmeysk. Perhaps there's just been some muddle and confusion. I'm not going to go more deeply into this irrelevant story. Anyway, the fact is, as I said, that there's been destruction of these two important Patriot missile system. This comes after reports of other Patriot missile systems and launchers having been destroyed across the contact line, and with reports of any number of S-300 missile complexes, Buk missile complexes, Iris-Ts, NASAMs, all of these missile complexes destroyed one after the other over the last couple of days and weeks. Now, I'm not keeping a running total. Slavyangrad and Dima at the military summary channel have tried to do so. In both cases, I think they come up with figures in excess of 10 of these rare and expensive air defense complexes having been destroyed since the middle of February. One always has to be a little careful with such numbers because sometimes there's elements of double counting and, well, also misidentification of systems. But overall, I don't think there's any doubt that over the last few weeks, Ukraine's air defense system has taken an absolute hammering. And I've seen it suggested that in terms of overall cost, the price of the Patriot systems which have been destroyed in Ukraine now comes to around $19 billion. In other words, a third of the $61 billion appropriation which the Biden administration has been trying so far unsuccessfully to get through Congress. So, a disaster in terms of Ukraine's air defense systems. Now, why is this happening? The Russians in the past have not found it very easy to destroy Ukrainian air defense assets. It is likely that they have significantly improved their surveillance capabilities. Now, there's been a lot of attention given to the large number of drones that the Russians now operate over the Ukrainian battlefronts, surveillance drones. But it seems to me that there is at least another possibility, and that is that the Russians, over the last year or so, have significantly increased the number of surveillance satellites they have launched, which operate over Ukraine and keep track of what is happening on the battlefronts. Patriot missiles, S-300 missiles, huge, complex machines, and they're not just machines. Launchers can only operate with the attendant vehicles, so it's probably difficult to conceal these vehicles and these machines, and the Russians now have lots of drones and lots of satellites, and they're able to track these systems as they move around Ukraine. That is one possibility. Of course, there's also a possibility that the Russians have managed to penetrate in some way the Ukrainian defense system, the Air Defense Command. Maybe they've broken their codes, are able to hear their messages and, decrypt their messages. Or perhaps, not impossible, they have human agents that they've managed to infiltrate into the Ukrainian Air Defense Command, and that these agents are able to give them tip-offs about the movement of these air defense systems. But of course, the ultimate reason why this is happening is because Ukraine is faced by this relentless bombing offensive by the Russian Air Force of its frontline forces. And indeed, only yesterday, we got further reports that the Russians have now introduced a new precision-guided bomb, which is boosted by a small jet engine, and that increases the distance that it can operate, which increases the reach that Russian aircraft now have in terms of dropping these bombs. The effect of these bombs has been devastating. I come back to the comments made back in 2022, the autumn of 2022, to me by one of my correspondents from India, and he pointed out that if you're going to smash fortifications, fortified lines, artillery will eventually do it, but only after a long time. The way to do it quickly and to inflict the most damage is by dropping heavy bombs upon it. Even the strongest fortified lines can't withstand that kind of bombing. And on that front, by the way, yesterday, the Russians published astonishing footage of the effect of the dropping of a Fab 1500 bomb, a bomb, in other words, which weighs nominally 1,500 kilos, a ton and a half. Apparently it has around 600 kilos of explosive. Anyway, it was dropped on Krasnogorovka, and the cloud, which, by the way, was a mushroom cloud, but obviously we're not talking about nuclear weapons, but the cloud that rose after this detonation, the fall of this bomb, was simply enormous. I mean, it is horrifying to think what it must do to anybody, any soldiers caught beneath one of these bombs. And of course, it must be shattering the buildings to pieces. And I would add, by the way, that 1,500 kilo bombs are not the biggest bombs by far in the Russian arsenal. I remember some months ago pictures of the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, visiting a bomb factory somewhere, I think it was in the Urals, and there was pictures of a newly made 9,000 kilo bomb, a 9-ton bomb. In other words, one that is multiples more powerful than the 1,500 kilo bomb that was dropped on Krasnogorovka. I don't think bombs of that size can be made precision guided, and obviously they would have to be deployed from much bigger aircraft than the Sukhoi 34s and Sukhoi 30s and 35s that are currently roaming the battlefronts. You would have to use Tupolev 22 M3s in order to do it. But potentially, perhaps, these bombs might be used at some point over the course of this conflict, and of course the effect of them would be colossal. I mean, it's unthinkable what kind of an effect a bomb like that might have on fortified positions. And of course, the hunt by the Russians of these Ukrainian air defense systems is precisely intended to make the day when big Russian bomber aircraft like the Tupolev 22 M3 can roam over Ukraine. Well, the intention is to bring that day closer. Perhaps we will never reach it, but then you never know. And going back to a point I've made over the course of many programs, it's absolutely clear that since October 2022, the primary objective of Russian missile strikes was specifically to exhaust the Ukrainian air defense system, the original air defense system built around the S-300 missile complex, which Ukraine inherited from the Soviet Union. The Russians attacked Ukraine's energy system over the course of the winter of 2022-2023 for multiple reasons, but one of them, undoubtedly, was to oblige Ukraine to expend most of its S-300 missiles, trying to bring down these Russian cruise missiles that were attacking their energy system. And it's clear that by the spring of 2023, the original Ukrainian air defense system built around the S-300 had been largely exhausted. The West stepped in, tried to supplement the system with Patriot missiles and NASAMS missiles and the French ASPID systems and the and other systems as well. But the IRIS-Ts from Germany, the NASAMS from Norway. But it's clear that this air defense system that replaced the previous Soviet one was more limited in scale and much more fragile, and the Russians have been hunting it. So they are clearly going after these missiles. And at the same time, because the Ukrainians are trying to counter the effect of the Russian Air Force on their front lines, they are obliged to do that which Julian Röpke, in his statement on X, is criticizing them for. They're obliged to bring their heavy air defense systems closer to the front lines, where the Russians can track them and more easily destroy them. So this is turning into a complete disaster. Now, as I've discussed again in recent programs, there's been a lot of talk recently about Ukrainian successes in shooting down Russian aircraft. I've pointed out in the past that these Ukrainian claims come with almost no corroboration. No less an agency than the Institute for the Study of War has now followed up expressions of skepticism from Oryx. The Institute of the Study of War says that contrary to Ukrainian claims, they can see no sign of any slackening in the Russian bombing effort on Ukrainian front lines. The Ukrainians claimed that there had been such a slackening, which they attributed to the shooting down of Russian aircraft. The Institute for the Study of War says that they have seen no sign of such a slackening. So the Ukrainians have claimed that they've shot down Russian aircraft, but have provided next to no evidence of this. The Ukrainians have made claims about destroying Russian warships in the Black Sea. Well, there is some corroboratory evidence of this, and as I've discussed, there is no doubt that the Ivan Kotov patrol ship was indeed sunk about a couple of days ago. But again, there is a dearth of corroboration from the Ukrainians from some of these claims, though I would say that I give the Ukrainians a greater benefit of the doubt here than over the claimed aircraft losses. I think there is some reason to believe that at least some of the Ukrainian claims about destroying Russian ships are true. But what we actually have over the last couple of weeks is irrefutable claims, evidence from the Russians of their systematic destruction of valuable and irreplaceable air defense launchers across the conflict line in Ukraine. And that is of much greater significance, and it is confirmed, and it is a disaster for Ukraine. If the air defense system is totally destroyed, coming on top of the effective destruction of Ukraine's air force in the autumn of last year, I discussed it in various programs at the time. Despite the probable deployment of the F-16s sometime in the summer. If the air defense system is destroyed entirely, then the Russians will be able to roam across most of eastern and central Ukraine without meeting much in the way of resistance, and at that point they'll be able to bomb and destroy whatever makeshift defenses the Ukrainians put together, and their pressure on the front lines will become increasingly irresistible. This over and above the fact that their army is getting bigger in size all the time and is being more heavily equipped as well. So there we go. A disaster in air defense terms by Ukraine on the battlefronts yesterday, with the loss of 2, perhaps 3 Patriot missile systems, all in the course of a single day and as a result of a single strike. Now, the Russians have been busy also in other respects. Firstly, I ought to say that every night now, without fail, the Russians launch massive drone attacks across Ukraine. And they are using more and more drones, whereas launches of missiles, of cruise missiles, have become fewer. And this is not because the Russians are unable to produce cruise missiles or because they're running out of missiles. It is because with the destruction of so much of Ukraine's air defense system, Ukraine is losing its ability, most probably, to shoot down sufficient numbers of these Russian drones to be able to, in effect, negate these drone strikes. There is little point for the Russians in launching expensive cruise missiles, especially hypersonic cruise missiles, if they can launch much cheaper uranium-2 drones, which will still get through and which cost only a fraction of what the cruise missiles cost. I suspect that the cruise missiles are being husbanded. Their number probably is also increasing, and the Russians are probably increasing the number of their cruise missiles and their arsenal of their cruise missiles in preparation for either the final offensive against Ukraine or in response to the deployment of any Western troops in Western or Central Ukraine, such as President Macron is talking about. We will come to that later in this program. But anyway, the Russians have been continuing to launch drone strikes across Ukraine. They apparently discovered and destroyed an important facility housing boats, amphibious boats across on the Dnieper River. They also destroyed an important electronic intelligence gathering and site created by the Soviet Union near Odessa. It was a sort of spy station of the kind that we was created all throughout the Cold War. Apparently, after the Soviet Union broke up, NATO gradually took it over. It seems most of this facility has now been destroyed. And of course, the Russians continue to launch drone strikes against warehouses, ammunition depots, command posts, all of that kind of thing. For heavy bunkers to attack bunker complexes in Kiev and such places, they would need to use missiles. But at the moment, at least, they haven't done so for some weeks. Probably, as I said, they're building up their stockpile. Anyway, drone launches intensifying as the Ukrainian air defense system starts to wither, and in some places in Ukraine appears to have largely broken down. And in the meantime, the Russians continue their offensive on the, well, they don't call it an offensive, but let's say their advances on the Ukrainian battlefronts. Now, I discussed a few moments ago the heavy Russian bomb strike on Krasnogorovka. It appears that fighting in Krasnogorovka is continuing at a very intense level. The Russians firmly entrenched now in the southern part of this small town. There's been some claims that the Russians have made further advances in the other village or town of Pervomaisky to the north. But anyway, we haven't had much in the way of news, but the fighting in Krasnogorovka is clearly very intense. And last night, there were lots of reports of massive Russian shelling of the remaining Ukrainian positions in the western part of the village of Novomykhailovka, south of Marinka. It's assumed that the Russians are going to begin their storming operation of the remaining Ukrainian positions in this large and strategically important village at some point in the next few hours or days, and that they will probably soon bring the whole of Novomykhailovka under control. And there's also now been at least some proof of Russian advances in the Liman area towards the village of Terny. There's been reports that a bridge built over a dam linking Terny to the west bank of the Dnieper River has been destroyed, and it's been suggested that it was the Russians who destroyed it. Dima at the Military Summary Channel suggests, on the contrary, that it was more probably destroyed by the Ukrainians as they withdrew from Terny to the west bank of the Dnieper River. And there have apparently been some pictures or photographs from this area, not from, as I understand it, Terny itself, but from nearby, which do appear to suggest that the Russians are indeed either close to capturing this village, or perhaps, though we've seen no confirmation of this from the Russian Defense Ministry, perhaps they've already captured it. We'll see. Anyway, things like that going on. Also, lots of discussions about continued fighting in the Rabotino area. I will say again, the Russian Defense Ministry has provided us with an estimate for Ukrainian casualties in the fighting in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area over the last 24 hours. And it says that these numbered 55 Ukrainian troops, 6 motor vehicles, 1 D-30 howitzer, and 1 Khortytsa electronic warfare station. By the standards of this war, these are limited casualties. And again, I can't help but think that the fighting in Rabotino and Verbovoye remains something of a sideshow. There's been multiple reports that the Ukrainians are trying to create or build defense lines north of the town of Orechov, further north from Rabotino. Orechov was the launch point of Ukraine's summer offensive. Apparently, it's about the distance between Rabotino and Orechov is, I believe, 14 kilometers. So well within a day's drive. It looks as if the Ukrainians realize that at some point they will have to abandon Rabotino and Orechov as well, and cede all the gains they achieved over their summer offensive. But for the moment, as I said, this remains a relatively small theatre. It's a sideshow compared to the big action. Now, by contrast, in Avdiivka, the action, the fighting remains incredibly intense. The day before yesterday, the Russian Defense Ministry claimed that Ukraine lost 460 troops killed and wounded in the Avdiivka area. Yesterday, they said that Ukraine lost 450 troops dead and wounded in the Avdiivka area. This is a huge number of losses. And we've now had a comment from a Ukrainian soldier which appears to corroborate Russian claims. He says that the Ukrainians retain tenuous control over small parts of Toninka and Orlovka, these two important villages. But he described the situation of the Ukrainian troops who are trying to hold out in these two limited locations, in these two villages, as hell. That is what he said. It was a hellish situation. Beyond that, there are reasons to think that the supply lines to this small group of Ukrainian soldiers hold up in northwest Toninka, that the supply lines have been cut and that these troops are effectively encircled. It looks likely that the Russians will complete the capture of Toninka and Orlovka within the next few hours, and perhaps they've already done so. There is also continues to be intense fighting in BITCHUTE, but apparently, again, the Russians now control most of this village. So, Avdiivka, a place where the Ukrainian forces have suffered huge losses over the last few days, 2 weeks or so, as they've struggled to try to hold back the Russian advance. Now, there have been some reports concerning the commitment of forces that Ukraine made, or General Syrskyi made, to try to hold back the Russians in the Avdiivka area. And some of the claims are astonishing. Supposedly, up to 7 or 8 brigades were deployed to try to hold this line of villages west of Avdiivka. 7 or 8 Ukrainian brigades, a force of 30,000 men, many of them brought from Ukraine's strategic reserve, to try to repel the Russian advance, to hold back, to stem the Russian advance in these 3 small villages. And of course, if we go back to the topic of the Patriot missile systems that were destroyed close near Pokrovsk yesterday, well, the reason they were there was to try to provide some air cover for those Ukrainian troops who are trying to hold on to their positions in these 3 villages. Now, again, I understand some of the military logic here. There are no clear defense lines west of these villages. There's a river line. There's a small river somewhat to the west, and it's been suggested that this might form a future defense line, but apparently there's very few fortifications of any significance along this river. And Syrskyi also had to deal with a situation of panic on the part of the Ukrainian troops who had fled Avdiivka. So by coming to the scene, giving orders that these three villages had to be defended, ordering a counterattack to push the Russians back from these villages, well, he ended the panic and stemmed the rout, and some would say he bought himself and Ukraine more time. But I have to say, to me it looks as if he's done it too far, too close to Avdiivka. What he has contrived is a situation where, again, a large part of the Ukrainian army is being sacrificed for the defense of three villages, which, whatever fortifications can be hurriedly built along this river line, whatever fortifications are built along this river line, the loss of so many of Ukraine's best soldiers holding these three villages mean that the river line will actually be more difficult to defend going forward. Perhaps it made sense to launch the counterattack, the original counterattack, the one that pushed the Russians back, hold these villages for a day or so, and then gradually withdraw back to the river line. That might have been an intelligent, a wise strategy. But instead, Syrskyi has done that which he always does. He launched his counterattack. It achieved some temporary success. It bought him a little time, but he has squandered that time by holding on to the gains that he's made in these three villages, the undefendable gains that he's made in these three villages, ultimately weakening his overall position. Anyway, just saying, this is again my view. I'm not, again, I want to stress, any sort of military expert. I've never involved myself in military matters. But it is consistent with the way that Syrskyi acts, and it seems to me that this is basically what has happened in this case. Now, I'm not going to predict how soon it will be before these villages are captured. They might already have been captured by the time this program is published. We shall just have to wait and see. Anyway, it also looks as if Ukrainian defenses in Ivanivska are now also crumbling. There's been reports that the Russians now control 80% of this important village east of Chasov Yar and west of Bakhmut. In other words, it looks as if we're coming to the end of the battle for Ivanivska. And if Ivanivska is captured, as it is certain to be before long, then Ukrainian defenses to the south of Ivanivska, in places like Kleshevka, Andreevka, will collapse as well. The Ukrainians, also it seems to me, will be forced to withdraw from these places. And I suspect also that the Ukrainian defenses further north in Bogdanovka will also crumble. It seems to me that a couple of weeks ago, the Russians had a choice between focusing on Bogdanovka or focusing on Ivanivska. they decided in the end to focus on Ivanivska, Krasnoye, as the Russians refer to it, principally because I think that they realized that if they capture Ivanivska, it will have a more immediate effect on the Ukrainian defense positions west of Bakhmut, whereas if they'd captured Bogdanovka, well, that would have meant that there was still a lot of fighting to do further south. So they focused on Ivanivska. For all I know, the Russian advance on Bogdanovka was a diversion or a pinning operation. Again, these are tactical matters that I'm not able myself to discuss in any informed way. But one way or the other, it does look as if Ivanivska is about to fall. So, probably at some point over the next few days, we will have got news that the Toninka, Orlovka, Berdichi line has collapsed, finally, and that the Russians are pushing west. We will have reports that Novomikhailivka has been captured as well. I, by the way, suspect that if Toninka, Orlovka, and Berdichi fall, and the Russians are able to advance further west and quickly capture other villages to the west of Avdiivka, like Stepnoye, for example, at that point, Ukrainian defenses in Pervomaisky will probably collapse as well, and Nevoskoy further south. And at that point, of course, the Russians will be in a very strong position to launch their major attack on Krasnogorovka, which, as I said, I personally think is their principal priority at the moment. First, Avdiivka, then Krasnogorovka, after Krasnogorovka, perhaps Pokrovsk, or maybe they're planning something else in some other place. I'm not going to try to guess. But once again, finishing off with Syrskyi, his decision to hold on to these villages, Orlovka, Berdichi, Toninka, probably also the reason why those Patriot missile launchers had to be deployed so close to the contact line, 40 kilometers from the contact line, according to Julian Orlovka. They were probably there to provide some kind of air cover for the Ukrainian soldiers trying to defend themselves in 3 villages. As we see, the net effect is that the villages will be captured. Many of the best Ukrainian troops will have been killed or wounded and unable to participate further in the battle. Some of Ukraine's precious stock of Abrams tanks has also been destroyed in Berdichi, and now 2 or perhaps 3 Patriot missile launchers and the attendant radars and vehicles have been destroyed as well. It doesn't seem to me, as I said, that it is a good bargain what Syrskyi has achieved, buying himself a few more days. Anyway, there we are. A terrible situation on the battlefronts. And to repeat again, the point I continue to make, Brian Baltic, by the way, has done 2 successive good videos on this same topic. We are not yet seeing a major Russian offensive. Perhaps one will develop in the central area of Donbass, around Avdiivka, Bakhmut, Krasnogorovka, Marinka, Kurakhovo. Maybe this is the area of decision. Or perhaps it will be further north in Kharkiv. The Ukrainians, as I've said, very nervous about the situation in Kharkiv, evacuating people from villages there, conscious of a steady build-up in Russian forces in this area. Dima at the Military Summary channel yesterday made the point that Russian cross-border raids along the border between Russia and Kharkiv region are becoming now more aggressive, that the Russians are not just sending reconnaissance groups across the border, but they're now engaging in heavy shelling, in bombing. They've been sending drone strikes with Lancet kamikaze drones to attack Ukrainian positions along the border. Maybe something big is coming there as well. But my own guess is that the priority now is to get to this river line, complete the capture of Krasnogorovka and Chasov Yar over the next few weeks, Novomikhailovka as well. And then, of course, the Russians will have a whole menu of options in front of them in late spring, early summer, when the new campaigning season presumably begins, and the Ukrainians are in an even weaker position than they are now. So that's my overall summary of the situation on the battlefronts. What else is going on? Well, Emmanuel Macron is, despite giving everybody, or at least giving the French, reassurances that he doesn't intend to send troops into Ukraine in a combat capacity, he's now veering again, as far as I can see, towards the idea of sending some sort of force into Ukraine. His foreign minister is now apparently in the Baltic states, and there's talk that the Baltic states might be prepared to send contingents into Ukraine as well, and that apparently Macron is trying to persuade them to do so. All of the other major military powers in NATO and the EU have flatly refused. President Biden, by the way, for the record, made it absolutely clear that there would be no US troops on the ground in Ukraine, at least no boots on the ground. Of course, there are plenty of American military personnel in Ukraine, but he means that there would be no organized combat formations. Radek Sikorski, the hardline foreign minister of Poland, has tried to hint that one day Poland might be open to this idea, but I suspect that he is something of an outlier in Poland on this issue. My understanding is that the Polish government and certainly the Polish people are strongly opposed to this idea. And to be frank, I don't think it's going to happen. But anyway, Macron has been sending his foreign minister to the Baltic states, and the Baltic states are being seduced by his words. And I'm going to suggest that this is a further example of what a disastrously dangerous person at this time Emmanuel Macron is. Because what he is doing is he is tempting the Baltic states into the thing that they should be most anxious to avoid doing. He's tempting them into a military adventure in Ukraine, taking on the Russians, which could very easily lead to the Baltic states becoming drawn into a war against Russia, which, to say it frankly, would result almost certainly in the Russian reconquest of the Baltic states if the war were to escalate and to continue to its eventual logical endpoint. Now, there's been an awful lot of talk recently about how the entry of Finland and Sweden has supposedly turned the Baltic into a NATO lake, and it's been suggested that the Sweden joining NATO, which has just been confirmed, ratified, means that Sweden can now act as a strong base position to support NATO forces in the Baltic states. Mikael Valtersen, who is, of course, a retired Swedish military officer, has, in my opinion, pointed out the fallacy behind this thinking. Because, of course, Sweden would still have a barrier between it and the Baltic states, and that barrier is the Baltic. You'd still have to send ships across the Baltic to reach the Baltic states. And of course, the Russians still have a very powerful presence in the Baltic, in Kronstadt, their great naval base created by Peter the Great, in St. Petersburg, in the Leningrad area, and of course in Kaliningrad. Any attempt to supply NATO troops in the Baltic states across the Baltic seems to me a wild one. And of course, it also opens up the possibility of the Scandinavian countries then also being dragged into a war. And the Russians have very, very powerful forces now arrayed potentially against the Scandinavian states in the Arctic and along the long border with Finland. These are wild and reckless ideas. My own view remains, as always, that the Baltic armies are far too small, that NATO would be ill-advised to deploy large forces to the Baltic states, where the Russians could quickly cut them off, that the Russians, far from being faced with a NATO lake in the Baltic, continue to have overwhelming power in this area. The only people who talk about NATO, the Baltic becoming a NATO lake, I think are simply not familiar with the reality of the huge industrial and military complex that and population complex that exists in St. Petersburg and in the Leningrad region, for example, which would enable the Russians to quickly bring overwhelming force to bear against any NATO forces in this area. Of course, you can always argue about nuclear weapons, but then, of course, we're already rapidly entering a World War III scenario. I think if the Baltic states send their troops to Ukraine, not only are they likely to be smashed, but they're probably more likely than not going to find themselves alone with the NATO countries very unwilling to come to the rescue of those Baltic forces in Ukraine, and with the Baltic states themselves extremely vulnerable to a Russian reaction. Again, I do wonder whether Macron understands what he is doing. I get the sense that in Germany, and by the way, also in the United States, people are becoming increasingly angry with him and are not happy at all by the adventure that he is leading France and Europe into in Ukraine. Anyway, that's Macron. and his latest, I think, crazy ideas. There's still, by the way, no fully clear explanation of why precisely he's acting in this bizarre way. But what he's doing is dangerous, obviously, for France and for the French army. And if he really does manage to tempt the Baltic states into joining him in some Ukrainian adventure, then all I can say is he will deserve whatever condemnation comes to him as a result of the consequence of this action. Anyway, that's Macron, and that's the French. We're now also getting reports in the Daily Telegraph that US officials are now warning European states that the United States might soon be leaving NATO, and that the Europeans will be left to fend for themselves and must therefore look to their own defense. Now, I wonder who exactly in the United States, which American officials are supposedly telling the Europeans this. I presume that this is a true story, that this is real information, but it does seem remarkable that US officials should be going around warning the Europeans in this way. I've discussed the atmosphere of panic that there has been in Europe over the last couple of weeks, having of the American officials turning up in European capitals, telling the Germans, the British, the French, and all the others that the United States might indeed leave NATO at some point over the next few months or years. Well, that again goes further to explain the panic, the catastrophe in Ukraine. Obviously is a reason. The fact that European leaders have destabilized their own economies, deindustrialized their industries, impoverished their citizens, reduced their global standing to pursue this project Ukraine, and that they're now seeing it fail. Well, that would cause them panic. The fact that they're going to have a far more powerful Russia on their hands, and an angry Russia on their hands, that is probably causing them to panic too. But, well, we've seen the telltale signs that the Americans are starting to shift away. The New York Times article a couple of weeks ago now, detailing American intelligence activities in Ukraine. Every single intelligence officer, retired intelligence officer that I know of, Larry Johnson, Tony Schaffer, an interview we did with him on the Duran, they're all saying the same. It's a sign that the United States is now preparing to close down its Ukraine operation, and the destruction of valuable Patriot missile systems in Ukraine by the Russians will probably reinforce that view. Anyway, that will have alarmed the Europeans. The disappearance of the scene of Victoria Nuland has also probably alarmed the Europeans. I've had a suggestion, by the way, from a member of the Duran community that Victoria Nuland might actually be considering a political career, that she might be standing for Congress, for example, in the forthcoming elections in November. That is distinctly possible, and we'll have to keep an eye out and see what happens there. Though I would say that She's never been someone who's held elected office before, and at 62, this would be rather a late time to start. But then, who knows? And now we've had these US officials apparently touring Europe, confirming to the Europeans that their worst fears are true, that some in the United States are increasingly thinking that the time has come to give serious thought to the United States pulling away. The Europeans must be feeling a little bit like the ancient Britons, the Romano-British, in 400 AD, when the Roman Emperor Honorius, who had all kinds of military commitments to fill in all sorts of places, as the Roman Empire crashed towards its inevitable decline. Anyway, he wrote a letter to the British telling them that he was pulling the Roman army out of Britain, and the point had now been reached when the British would have to look to their own defence. And of course, that was the end of Roman Britain and the start of what might be called the British Dark Age. Anyway, I'm not going to go back over that period of ancient history. I suspect, though, that the Europeans, hearing the Americans talk in the sort of way that the Daily Telegraph says that they are talking, that they must be getting butterflies in their stomach at the very least. Because, to be absolutely clear, militarily speaking, geopolitically speaking, the Europeans are unable to stand up to the Russians without the Americans, especially if the Russians complete their victory in Ukraine at some point over the next few months or perhaps year. At that point, the Europeans will find themselves once again up against the Titan, the Colossus to the east, and they won't have the Americans there any longer, and they must be aware that the state of their armed forces and of their defense industries is such that they really aren't in a position to stand up to the Russians in any serious fight. And that must be deeply alarming and unnerving. But is what these American officials are telling the Europeans actually true? Well, I have to say I have some doubts. Whenever this topic about the US leaving NATO comes up, always the personality of Donald Trump gets mentioned. It's always said that Donald Trump has given serious thought at various times to pulling the United States out of NATO. He has on occasion sort of publicly skirted around that possibility. But it's important to say that he is not currently campaigning on a platform of withdrawing the United States from NATO. I mean, I've never heard Donald Trump say that if he's elected president in November, he's going to withdraw the United States from NATO. I can't help but wonder whether these US officials, who the Daily Telegraph tells us are fanning across Europe, giving all of these warnings to the Europeans, that the Americans are preparing to pull out of NATO, whether they aren't political appointees of the Biden administration trying to solidify European support for Biden in advance of the November election, and perhaps to get the Europeans to support whatever radical steps the Biden administration might be considering taking in the United States in advance of that election. As my attentive viewers will have realized, in my last words, I have chosen my words extremely carefully. Anyway, the point is that when the American government itself starts floating the possibility of the United States leaving NATO, that breaks a taboo and it makes it more likely. I don't expect it to happen anytime soon. At the moment, all of the indicators are that the United States continues to remain deeply committed to NATO. It still sees NATO as an essential element in the US's overall strategic posture. The fact that the United States has allies in Europe is an important aspect of the US's global position as a geostrategic superpower. So I don't see the Americans just walking away from this so quickly. But of course, when I talk about the Americans, I mean the American military, foreign policy, and political elite. Amongst the wider American public, the sentiment may be changing. They may be saying increasingly to themselves that membership of NATO isn't something that has any real bearing on the needs and concerns of the American people, especially given the fact that there are reasons to think that the underlying situation of the economy, the American economy, is becoming more unstable. A little noticed fact about Biden's State of the Union address is that he was basically hinting at significant tax increases after the election. And it's not difficult to understand why. The United States has been running massive budget and trade deficits. There must be increasing warnings that the situation is becoming unsustainable, with the United States allegedly adding $1 trillion of debt every 100 days. And there are probably warnings to the president from within the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve that once the election is out of the way, assuming that Biden is re-elected, taxes must rise. Now, he tried to justify it or prepare the ground for it by doing so in a leftist populist way, by talking about taxing the rich, taxing the big corporations, doing those sort of things. But the key thing to understand is that that might be what he intends to do, but the fact remains he is talking about increasing taxes. And that suggests that all in the economy is not well, a fact which on the Duran we've been saying for a long time and which most Americans, I think, instinctively feel. So given that this is so, it might be that the point has now been reached when a plurality, perhaps even a majority of the American people, if the question was put to them, would say, well, the time has come to say goodbye to NATO. Let's focus on our own pressing internal problems, and to the extent that there's a genuine threat to the United States, it obviously isn't coming from Russia. It's coming from China instead. And if we have to maintain a strong defense, it's in the Pacific where we should do so. Now, having said that, I want to stress I think this is a mood rather than a policy. I don't see this as Trump's platform at the moment to withdraw the US from NATO. But as I said, the very fact that it's been talked about, even if it's been done for party political and electoral reasons, it would be unsettling to the Europeans in light of everything else that's happening, the disaster in Ukraine and the shift of the mood in the United States, of which, of course, the Europeans themselves are aware. Now, what do the Europeans do? Well, there are all sorts of plans. Poland talks about acquiring nuclear weapons as the Americans go. Germany talks about doing the same thing, I believe. If the Greens back that, by the way, that will complete their metamorphosis from a peace party, an anti-nuclear peace party, into a pro-nuclear war party. But anyway, rather than embrace these dangerous plans, why not do that which they should have been doing from the outset, working to establish a good, stable relationship with Russia? Bismarck famously once said that the secret of politics is a good treaty with Russia. Surely that ought to be the objective now. The Russians are no longer promoting world revolution or European revolution or the establishment of communism across Europe as they were 30 years ago, 40, 50 years ago. They are a conservative status quo power. They want to sort out the problems at their borders, as they've said. They have particular concerns about Ukraine and Belarus and perhaps the other former republics of the Soviet Union. There's no reason to think that anybody in Moscow seriously, or indeed is considering a march on Warsaw, let alone Paris, Berlin, or Rome. So why not put aside all of this, all these fantastic plans, acquiring nuclear weapons, trying to turn the Baltic into a NATO lake, stationing troops in the Baltic states, doing the crazy things that Macron is talking about, sending troops to Ukraine, to get a sense of how crazy things are in Europe at the moment. Consider what the British government has just done. Just yesterday, we learned the astonishing news, astonishing at least to me, that the British apparently decided that they needed to extend some kind of outreach to Maduro in Venezuela. Not quite clear what role they think he has in the Ukraine crisis. But anyway, the British decided that they needed to speak to Maduro, since to all intents and purposes their diplomatic contacts with him have collapsed and they don't want to suddenly appear to make up with him. The British Foreign Minister, David Cameron, had to look for an envoy to send to Caracas to meet Maduro, and the best he could come up with was Boris Johnson. So Boris sent off to meet Maduro in Caracas to achieve what precisely? Well, surely you're anyway speaking to the wrong person. Your problems are not with Venezuela or in Venezuela. You shouldn't be sending envoys to Caracas. You need to send them to Moscow instead. So it seems to me, surely that is the right thing to do, to come to some kind of understanding, modus vivendi with the Russians, except that Ukraine will fall back under Russian influence. Perhaps Moldova will as well, but you can say to the Russians, well, for the rest, let's all coexist peacefully, as we've done in the past, and maybe in time, things can improve and get better that way. There are voices of reason. The Swiss government, as I said yesterday, is apparently now saying that at the next Ukraine peace conference, the Russians must attend. President Erdogan tried to make Zelensky see this. Zelensky wouldn't listen. The Pope, of all people, has now come out and said that Ukraine needs to put aside its issues of faith, find the courage to negotiate with the Russians. And of course, the Pope, whatever else he is a well-informed person, as most people know. The Vatican has an extensive, well, you could call it an intelligence network if you wish. They're very well informed about what is going on around the world, and certainly in geostrategic terms. So, talk to the Russians. Don't panic. Don't come up with any of these crazy plans. But apparently, nobody is listening. The British prefer to send Boris Johnson to Caracas instead. I have to say, I find the whole thing so bizarre that it leaves me speechless. But I've discussed my astonishment many times. Anyway, as all of these weird and wonderful and frankly extremely dangerous maneuvers carry on, the Russians, of course, continue their operations in Ukraine, as the Russian Defense Ministry reports every day. It starts its every bulletin with the words, "The armed forces of the Russian Federation continue the special military operation." And it doesn't look as if that's going to change. And to repeat again, it is military events that are driving what is happening, and that seems certain to continue. Well, this is where I end today's program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and Twitter X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can check out our shop. All the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. More from me soon. Have a very good day.